Hi, I'm Darren. Welcome to this first Examiner's Headcast, first ever. As some of you may know, I've been writing a blog for the last couple of weeks, just trying to give you a few tips to get you ready for your various exams, language and literature, mainly focusing on AQA at the moment, mainly focusing on GCSE, but that all could change in the future. What I want to do in this first headcast is basically give you four things to remember, four things to think about before you head into your exams in the next few weeks. And a lot of you have an exam very, very soon, and I hope these four things will be helpful to you. Before I go through these four things, what I'd like to do is introduce you to someone. This is someone, if you've read some of my blog posts, you will be familiar with, and this is your examiner. And I've called him Jeff. I don't really know why. I quite like the name Jeff, I suppose. Jeff is the man, could be Jane, could be a woman, but let's just say for the sake of argument, this is the guy who will be marking your paper. Now, Jeff is probably almost certainly will be a teacher, an English teacher. Jeff will probably be quite young. He may well be marking some exam papers for a bit of extra money for a summer holiday. Well, why I'm telling you this is because this is who you're writing for. You're not writing for anyone else. You're not writing for your teacher. You're not writing for yourself. You're not writing for your friends. You're writing for a man or a woman sitting on their own in the evening, weekend, maybe summer holidays, with a pile, 500 exam papers that they have to get through in a certain amount of time. They have a mark scheme. That mark scheme is very, very strict. The reason that mark scheme is strict is so they can get through the papers quite quickly. You need to know this because, of course, you're going to be writing for this person, so you need to make sure that every single thing you say ticks one of the boxes. Every single thing you say gets a mark. This is the whole purpose of what I've been doing in the last few weeks with my blog posts, and this is why I've called this particular series The Examiner's Head, because actually to get inside the examiner's head can be very, very useful. So, without further ado, four things that I think you should focus on in the lead-in to your literature exams. Number one, I personally feel you should use a better system than P, point, evidence, explanation when you structure your essay. There's nothing really wrong with P. You've probably been using it since year 8 or year 9, and maybe that's the problem. It's quite basic, and I don't really think it gives you what you need to really stretch yourself when you're in exam conditions. So I'm going to give you an alternative. It's broadly similar to P, but it does take things a stage further. Now, I've called it EQAL. I think that's how I would say it. I've just made this up. I've just made it up. I've been teaching it for years, but it's not something you'll find anywhere else. I'm hoping this will give you just a little bit more depth, or enable you to write in just a little bit more depth. So what do we mean by EQAL? Okay, so first thing, introduce the quote. Put the quote in context. Where is it in the play, in the poem, in the novel, which chapter, which act, which scene, etc., etc. You're just going to place that quote into context so that you can then start to write about it. You then bring in the quote. The quote feeds into a sentence. This is the great thing about having a really short quote, 1 or 2 words, because you can write a sentence, drop the quote into the sentence in quotation marks. Third thing, okay, you're going to explain how the quote answers the question. That's analysis. We talk about writing analytically. That really is it. You're going to find quotes and you're going to explain how they answer the question. Okay, that's pretty well the same as P. Introduces the point, the quote is the quotation, and then the explanation. But we go deeper. You're going to add more. You're going to add more depth. You're going to add more detail. You're going to look at language features. You're going to look at structure. You may well bring in context as well. So you're going to take your analysis a stage further. And then you're going to bring in some linking words to link it into the next point. Okay, so again, quite similar to P, but it's just, for me, the add bit, the additional bits, the bit which takes you into the 7s and the 8s and the 9s. If all you do is make your point, bring in your evidence and explain it, you're kind of in the 5s and 6s in terms of grades. But if you can add more, bring in context, bring in language features, bring in something about structure, all linking into the quote, then you're going to be getting into the higher grades. Okay, let's see this in action. Okay, this is a response to the AQA sample paper question on Lady Macbeth, and it's the one about power. And I've just taken the first paragraph of an analysis of her soliloquy, the Unsex Me Here soliloquy. So let's just read it through, and then let's look to see how it's structured in that EQL way. The opening words of this monologue suggest her somehow owning the castle, by referring to it as my battlements. Contrasting with traditional notions of masculine ownership of property, Lady Macbeth is placing the seat of power, the castle, in her possession. This notion of her putting herself into a masculine position is further developed by the powerful phrase "unsex me here." By removing her femininity, she seems to suggest that she can become more powerful and in control. However, by doing so, Lady Macbeth also puts herself at risk of losing that which gives her balance. By casting off her natural femininity at the beginning of the play, she begins a chain of events which ultimately leads to her madness and death. References to her physical body are an important theme, both within this soliloquy and later in the play, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's just look to see where these different parts of this structure can be seen in the paragraph. It's fairly straightforward. So there's our introduction. Okay, our introductory quote, opening words of the monologue, we just say where it is. We then bring in the quote, and you can see the quote feeds into the question, to the sentence, by referring to it as my battlements. Begin your explanation. Lady Macbeth is placing the seat of power in her possession. To say that and then move on to the next point, you're in the kind of 5 territory. We then get into the 6 and the 7 and the 8 territory. The notion of her putting herself into a masculine position is further developed. That word further is indicating to the examiner you're saying more. Further developed by the powerful phrase "unsex me here." By removing her femininity, she seems to suggest that she can become more powerful and control. I've done one more thing there. I do this a lot, and I've always done this in my writing, and I've always taught this to my students. That colon after the quote. What that colon says to the examiner is, I'm about to explain. You've introduced the quote, you put a colon, and then you're saying that bit more. That's taking you into that kind of 7, 8, and even 9 potential territory with your grade. And then I'm adding even more because I'm bringing in a contrast. However, by doing so, she puts herself at risk, and so on and so forth. So I've brought in a point, I've added to it further, I've brought in something from another part of the play to show maybe a little bit of contrast. Remember, particularly plays are about change. So my strong suggestion when you're writing about the play, look at the way in which characters change. If your passage is from the beginning of the play, look at the way in which maybe the character has changed by the end of the play. It's really powerful, and that's getting you into the 8 and the 9 territory. And then, of course, at the end there, you've got that link, reference to her physical body, an important theme. That's taking you on to another point in your analysis. Okay, so that's point number 1. P's okay, but I actually think you can do better than that. Okay, number 2. Literary terms. Use them correctly and don't overuse them. There is such a danger when you're in your exam to try and cram in as many terms as you possibly can. Alliteration, simile, assonance, consonants, onomatopoeia, all sorts of things. Just cram things that are all the things you've revised. Don't do it. Don't do it, because your job is not just to list loads and loads of quotes, loads and loads of techniques. Your job is to analyze quotations. And when you're analysing the quotations, if there's something that stands out, refer to it, name it, and then explore it and explain it. This is critical because it just otherwise becomes an exercise in listing all the things you've learned. Well done you for learning them, but they're worthless unless you use them in the context of analysis. Let's see what I mean. Okay, so this is a paragraph that I've written in response to a question I made up. And the question is something along the lines of, with reference to War Photographer and one other poem, analyse how poets explore war, or explore the experience of war. I think it could well come up in the exam because there are quite a few war poems in the Power and Relationship anthology. Physical Power and Relationships, you know, the one with all the poems about war in. I think it could come up, and so knowing how to approach that, I think, is really, really useful. So this is a response, and you'll see this bringing in the language techniques at the right time. In the first stanza, Duffy presents us with a man in his dark room alone after coming back from a war zone. The adverb finally suggests that this is something he has been looking forward to, as if he has needed to escape the horror he has seen by retreating to his safe space. However, this safety is contrasted by the spools of suffering, the sibilants here drawing our attention to what he's looking at. There's juxtaposition between this suffering and the fact that it is laid out in ordered rows. The adjective ordered contrasts sharply with the chaos the man has been witnessing, making it somehow seem even more terrible. Okay, so let's look at where are those language techniques. Obvious: adverb, sibilants, juxtaposition, adjective. But look what follows all four of them. Analysis. The adverb suggests that, the sibilance is drawing our attention to, the juxtaposition, the adjective, makes it seem. So when you're bringing in those language techniques, always make sure that you're analysing following bringing them in. Otherwise, as I said, you're in the kind of fours and five territories, which is just listing stuff. Number 3. Use context only to add to your understanding of the quotes. Okay, I want to start by telling you my mantra. And if you can only remember one thing, remember this. Everything comes outward from the quotes. Okay, everything comes outward from the quotes. Everything you say, everything you write, all your explanations, they are coming outward from your quotes. Analysis is the explanation of how the quotes answer the question. Okay, nothing more, nothing less. So when you're writing about context, you're actually going to use context to inform your analysis of the quotation. What you don't want to do is you don't want to spend the first 2 or 3 paragraphs of your essay writing a great big long history of Jacobean England, James I and the Divine Right of Kings for Macbeth, or a great big long biography of J.B. Priestley, or a great big long exploration of the Depression of Mice and Men. Don't do that, because actually it's a complete waste of time. And I'll give you a few reasons why now. First thing is the fact that context is actually worth not very much of your final mark. Have a look at this. Paper 1, paper 2. 15% is explanation, analysis rather. 15% is the use of language, form, structure, etc. 3 is your context, and 4 is spag. First thing to say, look, paper 2 is actually worth more than paper 1, but this is where it's more interesting. 7.5%, okay, so 15% out of 100% is context. So it's not really worth that much. And if you look at it in this way, in terms of all of paper 1, context is worth 19%, and in terms of all of paper 2, context is worth 13%. So my strong advice to you is this: don't write a history essay. You're in an English exam, not a history exam, so don't start writing a history essay. Critically important. Okay, let's show you an example of how I might bring context in to a paragraph. Okay, so I've done a paragraph here actually, and I've imagined a question about Macbeth's fear of the consequences of his actions at the beginning of the play, and when we might see that fear later in the play as well. What I've done is I've brought in the quote, I've quoted, I've brought in some further analysis, some deeper analysis, so on and so forth throughout those 2 paragraphs. And then what I do is I actually bring in the context at the end. So let's just read it through. This soliloquy near the beginning of the play presents Macbeth alone thinking about the act of murder he's about to commit. His fear is palpable, both through the language he uses and the structure of his monologue. He begins by wishing the act were over quickly. By repeatedly referring to the murder as it, Macbeth shows the audience that he cannot confront it directly, thus showing his fear. The use of the colon after the opening leads Macbeth on to explain his hopes, that he will jump the life to come, jump over this act and into the life that he and Lady Macbeth dream of. The use of the conjunction but in the next part of the monologue suggests to the audience that he understands the reality of the situation. By referring to these bloody instructions, returning to plague the inventor, notice how I bring those quotes in, feed the quotes into a sentence. Macbeth foreshadows later in the play. In his final soliloquy, he refers to his life signifying nothing, as if he finally realises that everything he's done is worthless. The language of blood and plague emphasises the fear he currently feels. Macbeth's fear comes largely because he understands the gravity of what he's about to do. Regicide, the murder of a king, is the worst act anyone can commit. This was particularly so during Shakespeare's life, when the king was seen as having a direct line to God. A Jacobean audience would have been shocked at what Macbeth was considering. So there we are. We've explored, quotes, analysis, explanation, linking it all together, and then what we're doing is we're saying a final thing at the end, where we're showing how context feeds back in. It doesn't have to be at the end. It could be one or two sentences anywhere in the paragraph. What I'm saying is, don't just have context paragraphs which sit separately from the analysis. Context informs your exploration of how the quote answers the question. Okay, finally, know the difference between form and structure, and understand also how to write about structure in the exam. Okay, so what are the forms? When we talk about forms, very straightforward. There are four: non-fiction prose, fiction prose, drama, and poetry. In your literature exams, you're examined on 2, 3, and 4. And in your language exams, you're examined on 1 and 2. Within those forms, there are further forms. So, for example, within poetry, you might have the sonnet form, or the haiku form, or the ballad, or free verse, or there are lots and lots. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of different forms in poetry. Poetry itself is a form, but there are forms within poetry as well. Same with the novel, novella, short story, and so on and so forth. Within non-fiction, article, biography, autobiography, those are all forms. The reason I'm telling you this is because actually you're going to use particular language when you're writing about the particular form. So, for example, when you're talking about a novel, fiction prose, you're going to talk about a writer or a novelist, but you're going to talk about a playwright or a dramatist with drama, and you're going to talk about a poet with poetry. When you're talking about breaking down this piece of writing into smaller chunks, chapters for prose, acts, drama, and in poetry sometimes sections or parts, but in your exam you won't really have that. And then you're talking about the smaller units, paragraphs in prose, scenes in drama, stanzas in poetry. Please, please, please don't write about paragraphs in poetry. Drives examiners mad. And also don't write about verses. Verses are in children's nursery rhymes and songs. Use the word stanza when you're talking about the units that a poem is broken into. And when you're talking about us in relation to the text, you talk about the reader, or we, or us. In fiction prose, drama, it's the audience, or we. And then, of course, poetry, it's the reader as well. Going a bit deeper into the language that we use, or what we're looking for, I suppose, when we're talking about the different types of structure within the different forms. So when we're talking about drama, we're going to be looking at stage directions as well as what's said. We're looking at the way in which the dramatist or the playwright indicates to us, really actually the actor, because of course stage directions are originally to be read just by the actor. How is the playwright wanting the lines to be read? Or what does the playwright want the actors to be doing? For poetry, it's things like rhythm, line, stanza breaks, rhyme. These are formal elements that you need to understand and to write about. When you're writing about poetry, you really do have to write about rhythm, rhyme, etc., etc. And then with novels, sentences, paragraph lengths, but also with a novel, you can think a little bit like a film, if you like. Look at the way in which the writer moves you around the scene. Maybe he starts wide and zooms into certain characters. Maybe he moves you between scenes in one chapter or one passage. So with a novel, it's quite good to think about what does the writer want you to be looking at that particular time. So that's it. Just to finish off, just be kind to our examiner, Jeff. Give him what he needs. Make sure he can go tick, 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 tick when he's looking at your work. Make sure your work is clear, legible, easy to read. Remember, this guy's going to be potentially looking at hundreds of papers. So let yours be the one that stands out. Let yours be the one that he really enjoys reading, because you're far more likely to get the higher grades. Just a quick plug to finish off. I've written a book which I'm hoping would help you with your English language. It's available on Amazon for 99p. It's just called Examiner's Head Inside AQA English Language Papers 1 and 2. And also my blog is examinershead.wordpress.com. Good. So, good luck. And just remember those 4 things when you're sitting in your exam. Number 1, you're thinking about how you structure your paragraph so you really extend your analysis. Number 2, you're thinking about the language that you're going to be using and referring to technical terms, literary terms, language features, only if they add to the analysis. Number 3, that focus on context, but again, context coming outwards from the quote. And number 4, thinking about form, structure, using the right language to show that you understand the structure, the form and the structure that you're actually being examined in. See you again soon.